In the year 1303, in a small Italian town of Anagni, the unthinkable happened. Pope Boniface VIII, the most powerful man in Christendom, was seized by the French soldiers under the command of King Philip IV of France. As legend tells it, the Roman Pope was struck across the face in what is infamously known as the slap of Anagni. The blow symbolized not merely the humiliation of the Pope, but also the collapse of centuries-long dream, the idea that the vicar of Christ ruled over all the earthly kings. The shockwaves from that moment would echo through the centuries, unraveling the medieval vision of one universal church and setting in motion the currents that would later surge into Protestant Reformation. In this brief episode, we shall look at three medieval popes who blurred the line between the church and the politics, the spiritual and the secular, and how later Reformation would correct the chaos created by the medieval Catholicism.
Welcome to Discern Scripture YouTube channel. We post videos regularly on various topics that are related to the biblical world, its history, and its present relevance. We would really appreciate if you subscribe and help us reach a wider audience. We are committed to bring unique content and fresh perspective to our analysis that will inform mind and strengthen faith. Please feel free to look through our recent series and other videos and share them with those that might be interested. Now let's get on with the video.
The birth of Papal Domination, Pope Gregory VII. To understand Anagni, we must travel back nearly 3 centuries to the 11th century to one man who lit the spark, Pope Gregory VII. Born as Hildebrand of Savannah, Gregory VII rose during a time when the church was mired in corruption, simony, clerical immorality, and heavy hand of secular rulers who appointed bishops as political vassals. In 1075, he issued a bold set of propositions known as the Dictatus Papae, a declaration that would redefine the nature of papal authority. Among its lines were these radical claims: that the Roman Church was founded by God alone, that the Pope may depose emperors, that the Pope may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked rulers. This was no mere reform manifesto. It was a revolution. Gregory VII proclaimed that the spiritual power of the papacy stood above every temporal throne, for the Pope was the earthly representative of Christ himself. The historian Walter Ullmann described this as the papal monarchy, a theocratic constitution in which divine law governs human order. Investiture controversy soon erupted. This controversy was a defining conflict between the papacy and the secular rulers over the appointment of church officials, particularly bishops and abbots within their ruling territories. Central to the dispute was the question: who held the authority to invest bishops with the symbols of their office, the Pope or the king? Traditionally, the kings had exercised influence in appointing bishops within their realms, blending spiritual and political authority. Gregory VII sought to assert papal supremacy and enforce the Gregorian reforms, which aimed to eliminate simony and clerical secularism. Conflict escalated when Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV for continuing to appoint bishops without his approval. When Henry defied him, Gregory excommunicated him. This prompted Henry to perform the famous walk to Canossa, as he walked barefoot to Canossa in 1077, begging for absolution in the snow. This struggle highlighted the tension between the spiritual authority and temporal power. The bishops controlled not only religious, but also political and economic resources. That scene became the emblem of the new age, the church triumphant over kings, the spiritual sword sheathing the temporal one. The idea behind the transformation was expressed through a powerful metaphor, the two swords theory, or the two swords doctrine. Its roots lie in Luke chapter 22, verse 38, where the disciples present 2 swords to Jesus, and he answers, "It is enough." Medieval theologians interpreted this as symbolizing 2 powers given by God: the spiritual sword wielded by the church and the temporal sword exercised by kings. But who ultimately held both swords? By the late 12th century, the papacy claimed that both swords ultimately belonged to the church, though the temporal one was delegated to the secular rulers. This view reached its most refined form under Pope Innocent III between 1198 to 1216. Now let's talk about the height of papal domination under Pope Innocent III. Pope Innocent III was one of the most powerful medieval popes. He asserted papal supremacy over both spiritual and temporal realms. Pope Innocent intervened decisively in European politics, influencing kings and emperors, and even deposing rulers, demonstrating that secular power was subordinate to the papacy. He launched crusades and supported expansion of the papal bureaucracy. Under his leadership, the papacy became the central political authority, shaping medieval European society. This is what Pope Innocent declared. As the sun and the moon are different lights, so the papal authority is to the royal power. One greater, the other lesser. One governs the day, another night. He asserted that kings ruled only by divine permission through the mediation of the church. The spiritual power, like the sun, illuminated and judged the political world. Innocent's papacy represented the zenith of papal monarchy. He deposed kings, placed kingdoms under interdict, and called for crusades against sects that he considered to be unorthodox. This, this was the Pope that authorized the Albigensian Crusade in 1204 that led to the indiscriminate massacre of 20,000 Cathars, irrespective of rank, sex, or age. The papal legate sent by Pope himself allegedly said, "Kill them all. God knows who are his." The popes, such as Innocent, wielded the sword of the secular rulers with impunity against whomever they considered to be their enemies, often branding them as enemies of the church or enemies of Christ. Under his pontificate, the papacy became not merely the head of the church, but the apex dominator of the medieval society. The English historian Brian Tierney later observed that by this time, the papacy had come to see itself as the supreme arbiter of human history, standing at the meeting point of heaven and earth. Now let's move from Pope Innocent III to Boniface VIII. After Pope Innocent, the machinery of papal supremacy continued to expand. Canon lawyers developed a rich body of papal jurisprudence, arguing that since the Pope was a vicar of Christ, his power was absolute in matters of salvation. And since kings existed to preserve the moral order, they too must obey him. By the late 13th century, this ideology was hardened into what is called the ecclesiastical absolutism of the papal court. It is within this climate that Pope Boniface VIII emerged, proud, learned, and convinced that he embodied the plenitude of the papal power. When he ascended to the papacy in 1294, he inherited both the glory and the burdens of his predecessors. But the world has changed. The old unity of Christendom was fracturing. Monarchies like France and England were rising in national strength. Kings now taxed clergy, waged wars, and governed with sense of sovereignty unknown in the earlier centuries. For Boniface, this was not progress. It was open rebellion. It is in this context he had a clash with Philip IV. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, was young, ambitious, and utterly determined to make France supreme. To finance his wars, he taxed the clergy, a move Pope Boniface condemned as a violation of church's freedom. In 1296, the Pope issued a bull, Claricis Laicos, declaring, "We declare it to be illicit for any layman to impose taxes on clergy without the express permission of the Apostolic See." Philip retaliated by banning the export of gold from France, cutting off Roman income. The conflict escalated. Accusations, propaganda, and political maneuvering followed. In 1302, Boniface convened a great assembly in Rome and issued one of the most explosive and controversial documents in papal history, the papal bull titled as Unum Sanctum. Unum Sanctum, the climax of papal domination. Unum Sanctum means one holy church. It was a final and most extreme expression of unbiblical medieval papal dream. It declared this: We are compelled by the faith to believe and to hold that there is one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and that outside this church there is neither salvation nor remission of sins. This was traditional doctrine. But what came next was the most controversial conclusion. We declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. In the same document, Boniface explicitly invoked the two swords doctrine. Both swords, the spiritual and the temporal, are in the power of the church. The one to be wielded for the church, the other by the church. The former by the hand of the priest, the later by the hand of the kings and knights, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. This was the theological culmination of the Gregorian vision, the belief that the church, as the spiritual authority, commanded the very conscience of rulers. The Pope, as God's vicar, stood above every earthly jurisdiction. Historian Unum noted, Unum Sanctum was not an innovation, but the logical endpoint of a doctrine centuries in the making. The slap of Anagni and the decline of papal monarchy has to be understood in this context. What Gregory VII could achieve against Henry IV in the 11th century, Boniface VIII could not do it against Philip IV in the 14th century. The world had changed, and the papacy, despite its grand claims, could no longer command obedience. Philip accused Boniface of heresy, immorality, and even sorcery. In 1303, King Philip's agent led armed men to Anagni, where they burst into the papal residence. The aged pope was seized and allegedly struck the slap of Anagni. Boniface died within weeks, humiliated and broken. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, placed Boniface in the infernal pit of Simonists, a poetic reflection of the disillusionment many felt with the papal power. The papacy itself never fully recovered. Within a decade, it fell under French control in what became known as the Avignon papacy, the Babylonian captivity of the church. The dream of universal papal monarchy was over by this point. Yet the ideas forged in this medieval struggle would not disappear. The claim of papal supremacy, absolute spiritual jurisdiction under the unity of Christendom under one head, would eventually face its most devastating challenge in the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther stood before the Diet of Worms in 1521, he was not merely rejecting indulgences or corruption. He was rejecting the centuries-old system that had placed Pope above kings and nations. Luther's doctrine of the two kingdoms, the spiritual and the temporal, each independent under God, was in direct opposition to the Unum Sanctum model of conceptualizing the relationship between church and the state. As he wrote, the Pope crowns and uncrowns emperors, but Christ alone is Lord of the conscience. In a sense, Luther's protest was the final echo of Anagni, a definitive break from the medieval dream of a single theocratic world order. The papal monarchy had overreached. Its collapse was not sudden, but the result of the long tension between spiritual manipulation and political realism. Here is my closing reflection. The story of Popes Gregory VII, Innocent III, to Boniface VIII is not merely about power. It is about the struggle to define where the divine authority meets human governance. For centuries, the church claimed both swords, one to guide, one to govern, seeking to harmonize heaven and earth under the cross. But as history unfolded, the two swords drew blood not against heresy alone, but against each other. The slap of Anagni was not just an insult, it was a symbolic breaking of the church's temporal sword. From that moment onward, the sacred and the secular would walk separate paths. Kings would claim divine right, nations would form identities apart from Rome, and the Reformation would declare that salvation comes not through the subjection to the pontiff, but through faith in Christ alone, solus Christus. And so from the snows of Canossa to the dust of Anagni, the trajectory that began with Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae found its tragic fulfillment in Boniface's Unum Sanctum. As a historian Colin Morris once wrote, the story of the dream, a dream of a world perfectly ordered under God, was shattered when man's power outgrew his faith. Events like Anagni showed that the political domination was slipping out of the Catholic papal control. The Reformation that Luther initiated showed that the unrivaled spiritual grip Rome exerted over the faithful would be challenged as well. God did set the church free from its medieval shackles through the echoes of the hammer that pounded on the doors of the Wittenberg church on October 31st, 1517. Thank you so much for watching. If this episode gave you something to think about, hit like and share this video and subscribe for more.